Okay, we're going to record. Hello, everybody, and welcome to class. My name is Curry Sontner. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the National Constitution Center. We are so excited to welcome you to our Friday class that is going to focus all about the 14th Amendment, incorporation, civil rights, and whatever other questions we like to ask our amazing professor today, because we have an amazing professor, Professor Shaw from University of North Carolina School of Law and the Center of Civil Rights. We were talking earlier before we got started, and Jeff already started jumping in. We just have a list of so many current events this week we can dive into. So without further ado, students, remember, put your questions in the Q&A or the chat, but I will turn it over to Jeff Rosen, our president and CEO, to get us started.
Thank you so much, Curry, and welcome again, Professor Shaw. It is indeed really exciting, friends, to share Professor Ted Shaw's wisdom with you. In addition to being one of America's leading scholars of the 14th Amendment, he's among our most distinguished civil rights lawyers, and he was the 5th director of the Legal Defense Fund of the NAACP, which is America's leading civil rights organization. So it's an honor to have you, Professor Shaw. And I think we just have to discuss the news of the hour. In literally an hour at 2 p.m., President Biden will announce the nomination of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson to the Supreme Court. So I thought I'd start off by asking you, what do you think?
Well, I agree. This is obviously a historic moment. We've been a country now for 230 some odd years, and there's never been a Black woman on the Supreme Court. For that matter, though, I have to say we've never had a Native American or an Asian American. I mean, we're still plowing new ground with respect to making our institutions look like America. But this is an important day, an important moment. We could have a whole discussion about the prudence of announcing that a president is going to appoint somebody from a particular group. But it's not the first time that it has happened. It's been done with respect to women. Race is always different in some respects. So there's some criticisms of the president for saying he was going to appoint a Black person. And some people even say it amounts to discrimination. But whatever the merits of those arguments, she is extremely well qualified. And this is a historic moment.
It really is. And it's so meaningful to be able to talk about it with you at this moment. I'll say that I met her at the National Constitution Center, where she came in 2019 to discuss the constitutional legacy of Alexander Hamilton. And she appeared along with our friend Dean Erwin Chemerinsky, and also with the very distinguished lawyer who is the wife of Lin-Manuel Miranda. And during this great panel, which, friends, you can see the video on YouTube, Judge Jackson said that her favorite lesson from the Hamilton story is you have someone who's an outsider, who's not an aristocrat, who's made an enormous difference in terms of the future of our country. It's so much an American story in the sense that this is the land of opportunity. People who come here to change their circumstances. His outside status and his work ethic, I think, is the biggest lesson I took away. Professor Shaw, do you know Judge Jackson at all, or do you have any reflections on her record and background?
I cannot claim to know her personally. We probably have crossed paths over the years, at least a time or two, but I can't claim to know her. I only know of her, and from what I know of her, as I indicated before, she has sterling credentials, a variety of experiences that aren't always represented among those who are on the Supreme Court. And I think that, and I hope that she adds to the collective wisdom on the court as a consequence.
She really does have that unique and important background, including serving as a federal public defender. How important is that background?
Well, I think it's extremely important. When you have a pathway to the court with respect to those who have criminal law experience that only consists of people who have been prosecutors, I think it's not surprising that you might get a point of view that slants in a particular direction. Someone who has been a public defender understands some things about the world in a way that I think brings value to the court. And so it'll be interesting to see, her career. I'm not presuming to say which way she's going to lean on any particular issue. That would be a mistake, of course, but it does bring significant knowledge about some things that we don't have. But if I can just say quickly, for example, I remember some years back, the Supreme Court had before the case that dealt with the issue of whether or not people could be ejected from public housing because there's a member of the family who gets involved, or it's demonstrated was involved with drugs. The court went in a certain direction on that. I happen to have grown up in public housing. I'm not trying to in any way say that drug usage is a thing that I recommend. On the other hand, there are people who live in houses that they own, and they get a benefit from the government also. They get a mortgage interest deduction. That is governmental support, indirectly as it might be. And we don't kick people out of their homes because somebody in the family was using drugs. And so somebody who had understanding of those realities might have brought something to that case. So I know that she'll bring some other wisdom to other cases that the Supreme Court considers.
That's such a powerful example of that the case involving public housing. And Judge Jackson did say at her 2021 confirmation hearings, there was a direct line between her work as a public defender and her later work as a trial judge. She said she was struck as a public defender by how little her clients understood about the legal process, despite the serious implications of criminal proceedings for their lives. As a result, as a trial judge, she took extra care to make sure defendants were aware of what was happening to them, because it's so important for people to understand what they've done, why it's wrong, and what will happen to them if they do it again. They can really start to rehabilitate. This question of a justice's background and perspective is so important. And you've had such a remarkable career at the LDF. Are there any particular cases where you think that the justice's background made a difference? And for example, did you work with or closely follow Judge Thurgood Marshall, who himself was such a heroic founder of LDF? And what can you tell us about Justice Marshall on the Supreme Court?
Well, Justice Marshall, of course, was one of the great American lawyers before he even went to the bench. And in terms of having an influence on our country, the work that he did helped to break the back of Jim Crow segregation in America. And that was tremendously important. But after he left the court, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, she said and wrote about how important his experiences were to what he brought to the bench, and how valuable it was for the other justices to hear some of those views and experiences when they were considering whether to take a case or discussing a case among themselves. And so I was struck by the fact that Justice Sandra Day O'Connor said that, but also we've seen that the women who have served on the Supreme Court now also bring a perspective that has value. And in fact, I think all of the justices bring experiences to the court. When I was first in law school, I think we were taught in the first year that judges, when they donned their robes, took off all of the rest of their experiences in their lives. That's a wonderful aspiration, perhaps. But I think that it's even more important that people they bring their wisdom and experience, but they also make sure that they are unbiased in their adjudication. This is an important nomination, but it's no more important than many of the others in some respect. People do bring their experiences to their wisdom on the court.
That story of Justice O'Connor and how impressed she was by Justice Marshall's personal experience is a remarkable story. She wrote, as you suggest, eloquently about it. There's a piece called Thurgood Marshall, The Influence of a Raconteur, where she's describing how she listened to Justice Marshall talk eloquently to the media about social stigmas, lost opportunities suffered by African-American children in state-imposed segregated schools. My awareness of race-based disparities deepened, and she thought that really made a huge difference on the court. Well,
and in fact, I think up until now, it may still be true that he's the only Supreme Court justice who ever represented a client in a capital case. I could be wrong about that, but certainly his experience in capital cases was something important that he brought to the court.
That's absolutely true. She stressed his representation of capital cases, and I'm looking at the article now and the stories that he experienced, just being threatened with violence when he would go into town to argue cases, and threatened, with guns, and how he, the courage that he had to show just to argue those cases was really incredible.
Yeah, I'm tempted to turn around and grab a book off the shelf, but I'll just mention it.
Yeah, go for it.
That all one has to do is read a wonderful book, Devil in the Grove, which is just gripping. It's about a case in Florida back in the 1950s that Thurgood Marshall worked, and it involved 3 or 4 young Black men who were facing the death penalty for a crime they didn't commit.
Wow. Extraordinary. Friends, definitely check that out. Well, time with you is so important. We should talk about the 14th Amendment. And
yes, we should.
Let me leave it to you to sort of tell us about, first of all, the path to Brown. The LDF had such a central role in that, and tell us about what Thurgood Marshall had to do and what Brown represents.
Yeah. So first, to talk about the path to Brown, yes, we need to talk about Thurgood Marshall, but before Thurgood Marshall, and if he was still with us today, he would say we have to talk about Charles Hamilton Houston, who's one of the greatest American lawyers and one of the least known. But he was Thurgood Marshall's mentor. He was a civil rights lawyer himself. He charted the path to Brown versus Board of Education, and he was also a dean of Howard Law School. There's a wonderful book that I commend to everyone. It's a long book, but it's worth reading. more than worth reading, and that is Simple Justice by Richard Kluger. It's one of the classics in law now. But you can't talk about Thurgood Marshall without talking about Charles Houston. Charles Houston was famously said, a lawyer is either a social engineer or a parasite on society. Not everybody agrees with it, but that's what he believed. And he turned Howard Law School into a factory for civil rights lawyers. Thurgood Marshall himself was denied admission to the University of Maryland Law School, his home state. He, under the tutelage of Charles Houston, became one of the most important civil rights lawyers that our country has ever seen. And he was the first director counsel of the Legal Defense Fund. In that role, he litigated many of the landmark cases. And in fact, if you go back and just look at the number of cases he litigated and argued in courts throughout the land, but particularly in the Supreme Court, it's extraordinary. And of course, the most famous of which was Brown versus Board of Education, which was decided in 1954. And Brown broke the back of legalized segregation and helped to open the door to the civil rights movement in general. Thurgood became the first African-American to serve on the Supreme Court, and is one of the great figures in American history now.
There's no question about it. Did you know him and work with him?
Well, a little bit. I have a picture I treasure downstairs on our wall with him and another great lawyer, Conrad Harper, who worked at the Legal Defense Fund. And but the reality is that by the time I started practicing and by the time I got to the Legal Defense Fund, we were pretty scrupulous in keeping some distance between ourselves and the members of the court. For obvious reasons. We didn't want to put him in a position where he would have to recuse himself or people would raise questions. And so I didn't have a whole lot of personal contact with him, although those lawyers who worked with him when he was at the Legal Defense Fund, like Jack Greenberg and the great Connie Motley, of whom there's a new biography that just came out. And some of the other lawyers did, from time to time, socialize with him, stay in touch with him, et cetera. Connie Motley, of course, had gone on to become the first Black woman. Talk about the first Black woman on a federal court. She was the first Black woman to be a federal district court judge or any kind of judge. But I know his family very well. I've been honored to get to know all of them very well. And Thurgood Marshall is one of my heroes.
He is indeed a hero. And since you mentioned Judge Constance Baker Motley, tell our friends about her and what some of her accomplishments were.
Well, Constance Baker Motley was the first woman to work on the staff of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And she was one of the lawyers who did work on Brown, but also more to the point, she didn't argue one of the Brown cases like Thurgood and Jack Greenberg and Bob Carter and others did. But she did some of the work on Brown. But in the late 1950s and particularly in the early 60s, she became one of the most extraordinary lawyers, civil rights lawyers there were. She represented James Meredith in the University of Mississippi case, and she represented the plaintiffs who desegregated the University of Georgia. She represented plaintiffs in higher education desegregation cases at the University of Alabama. Throughout the South, and she was courageous. Her life was often threatened, but she was fearless. Connie Motley argued somewhere around, I think it was 23 or 24 cases. I may have the number wrong. She only lost one. that was a case that should have gone the other way. It involved the question of juries and race discrimination in the selection of juries. And some years later, a couple of decades later, the court changed that jurisprudence, and Judge Motley would say that she won all of her cases, and she did. Extraordinary woman. As I said, there's a new biography, and it's supposed to be pretty good. I have it on my shelf here. I just got it. It just came out. I haven't read it yet. And there's also her autobiography that she did.
That is so inspiring to hear about all her victories, and great to hear about that last case. You know, I think it's so meaningful for you to tell us about all these heroes of the civil rights movements. I'm just looking now at your predecessors and successors as LDF Directors Council. What an astonishing group. Thurgood Marshall, Jack Greenberg, Julius Levon Chambers, Elaine Jones, Ted Shaw, John Payton, Sherilyn Ifill, and now, of course, we have Janae Nelson has just taken over.
Yes.
Do you want to tell our friends about any of those other great predecessors?
Well, I could talk about all of them. I mean, I would say I'm honored to be among them. It's high cotton, as the saying goes. You know, most people don't know who Julius Chambers was. I hold an endowed chair in Julius Chambers' name. And I quickly I'll try to do this quickly. Julius was born in North Carolina during the Jim Crow era. And his father was, he had a auto repair shop, and one day a white man brought a truck in, and Julius's father did the work, and the man wouldn't pay. Long story short, he couldn't get a lawyer to pursue this man. Nobody would represent him, and Julius decided he would become a lawyer right then when he was a boy. Fast forward, he goes to the HBCU, the historically Black college. It was the only place he could go to college, or one of the only places in North Carolina at the time. Graduates near the top of his class, goes and gets a master's in history, I think it was, at the University of Michigan, extraordinary at that time, comes back to North Carolina and is admitted to UNC Law School, where he becomes the first African-American to be the editor-in-chief of the UNC Law Review, and he graduates in 1962, #1 in his class. Think about that for a minute. As Elaine Jones and I said on our way to his funeral, if he was #1 in his class, it couldn't have been close. And Julius became one of the most important lawyers in civil rights law history. Litigated landmark cases, voting rights, school desegregation, employment discrimination, car bombed, house bombed, his father's house bombed, office bombed. Julius just kept on going. I was honored to work under Julius's leadership as the third director counsel of the Legal Defense Fund. I can go on. Elaine Jones, one of the most extraordinary lawyers and people you'll ever meet. She's a powerhouse. First Black woman to graduate from the University of Virginia Law School, and an extraordinary lawyer. First Black woman or Black person, period, to be on the board of governors of the ABA. I could go on and on about Elaine. I was her deputy when she headed the Legal Defense Fund for about a dozen years. It was a great honor. And I shouldn't leave any of them out. I can't. Jack Greenberg, who hired me, one of the great civil rights lawyers. Sherilyn Ifill has done a tremendous job in the last years as heading the Legal Defense Fund. But, change is growth for individuals and institutions. And so she's stepping down in a month or so, and she is going to be followed by Janae Nelson, another lawyer whom I know from the time I was Associate Director Counsel and then Director Counsel, and whom I think the world of. And so it's an honor. The late John Payton, I could say a lot about him, who was ably involved in one of the leaders of the University of Michigan case. I hope I'm not leaving anyone out. And I have to mention also, though he was never Director Counsel, I have to mention James Madison Nabritt III, one of the great civil rights lawyers, whose father was one of the lawyers who argued Brown. Working at the Legal Defense Fund was a highlight of my life. And one of the great honors is getting to know all of these people.
Wow, I'm so glad that you gave us a sense of all of those incredible lawyers and their legacies. And I know our friends will want to follow up on many of them about reading biographies and articles. Before I turn it back to Curry, because I know there are great questions from the chat, are there any books or biographies of lawyers, judges, or anyone else that you want to recommend before I turn it back to Curry?
Well, now there's a range of biographies and autobiographies by many of these folks. Thurgood Marshall never wrote an autobiography, but there's so many biographies of Thurgood Marshall. And as I said before, Simple Justice is one of the best books in law that I could recommend. There's a biography of Charles Hamilton Houston called Groundwork by Jenna Ray McNeil, who's recently retired from the University of North Carolina history department. There's Robert Carter's book that he wrote. And I'm just turning around for a minute. Matter of Law, the biography that just came out, Civil Rights Queen on Constance Baker Motley by Tamika Brown Nagin, who's up at Harvard. And then also Equal Justice Under Law, Connie Motley's own autobiography, I should say. There are books that have been written about all of these folks and more. Jack Greenberg's Crusaders in the Court, I'd recommend. I could go on. And you know what? I think probably what I ought to do is just send you a list of all of these books, but I suspect that you all know most of them already, if not all of them. So I'll stop there. I know we're supposed to talk about the Constitution and the 14th Amendment.
Well, you've done a lot to teach us about the Constitution by inspiring us to learn about the people who've helped to shape it. And those books you mentioned, including Equal Justice, Crusaders in the Court, Simple Justice. Friends, give yourself a gift and pick one of them and read it. You'll just expand yourself so much, and you'll be inspired by these heroes to do great work of your own. There's nothing better than reading about great lawyers to make you to want to do great things in the law. Thank you so much, Professor Shaw. It's just wonderful to learn from you. And Curry, back to you for some questions from our friends.
And I'm laughing because that was the number one question I had from the moment we started was, what book would you recommend? Because I was trying to jam my face in to see all the books behind your head. And I was like, oh, what books would you recommend? So thank you so much. And we love so much in this class when we talk about the people, because it's the people that make the 14th Amendment come to life, the people that utilize it, that charge forward and give it the power that it has. So for our students a couple of our students, have bell schedules, so they had to come in a little late. You were listing all these amazing lawyers that energized the 14th Amendment, all these amazing people like James Meredith, my favorite story, that really said, no, I'm going to make sure that this is living up to the promise. Can you break down for them really quickly, and I'm sorry, this is going to be a big ask, even though I say really quickly, the 14th Amendment, so they can see what big ideas are in the 14th Amendment that these people and these lawyers utilize to charge, to live up to the promise of the Declaration and the 14th?
Yes, I wish I could do justice to it if we, I've taught and I teach a 14th Amendment course. There were three amendments after the Civil War. The 13th Amendment that abolished slavery in the United States, the 14th Amendment that did a number of things, and then the 15th Amendment that guaranteed the right to vote against racial discrimination. The 14th Amendment, in many ways, is maybe the most important. And of course, it's an amendment that applies to everybody. It's just not an amendment for Black people, but it was principally and initially an amendment meant to bring Black people, those who had been enslaved, into the fullness of American citizenship. But it also did something right off the bat that has echoed down through the ages until today. The first clause of the 14th Amendment is the Citizenship Clause, which says that all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States and the states in which they reside. Think about all of the discourse, the divisiveness we had in recent years about citizenship and, who was American and who wasn't. The 14th Amendment settled that, or should have settled it. But there's also the Due Process Clause, the Equal Protection Clause, which is the main driver of anti-discrimination law, at least constitutional law. And the 14th Amendment has language that says no state shall. Therefore, it applied to the states. There were arguments about whether some of the other Bill of Rights amendments applied to the states at first, because they seemed to apply only to the federal government, the First Amendment, et cetera. But they were incorporated to apply to the states. I'll give you a quick example, if I may. When Brown was decided, Brown was actually 5 cases. A case from the most famous case, Brown, was from the state of Kansas, but then also Virginia and South Carolina, Delaware. There was a case from Washington, D.C., though. And Washington, D.C. was not covered by the decision, couldn't be covered by the decision in Brown that said that the states could not engage in racial segregation in public school education. The court had to write a separate opinion in Bowling versus Sharp, in which it basically incorporated against DC, which was run by Washington, the Washington government, the Congress, et cetera. The same principle that was articulated in Brown. In some ways, it was a reverse incorporation because it went to the federal government as opposed to the states. Incorporation with respect to the Bill of Rights, though, extended the Bill of Rights to the states. And so our country now has, whether we're talking about federal government, whether we're talking about state governments, through the Constitution, all kinds of provisions that guarantee some of our most important rights, freedom of speech, but also protections against discrimination. These things are what we consider to be our most important rights now. The 14th Amendment is still one of the most important constitutional provisions in this country. I could talk in great detail about the 14th Amendment and what it means. For example, very controversially, there was a provision in the 14th Amendment, Article 3, that people thought was dead letter law. and they thought it was dead letter law because, among other things, it prohibited those who had been in rebellion against the federal government in the Civil War from holding office. Well, we thought that was dead letter law, but that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment now is being raised by some people who say that those who engaged in the January 6th insurrection should not be able to hold federal office. Whatever you think about the merits of that, that's a 14th Amendment question that shows that there may yet be life in some provisions, like Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, that many people thought was now long dead letter law. I love the 14th Amendment. I think that we can't talk about our country and its history without understanding that the 14th Amendment was part of what Abraham Lincoln called the new birth of freedom, even though he never saw the 14th Amendment. And it has so much meaning for us today.
And that's unbelievable. And thank you. I feel so guilty of making you do it. It's so succinctly, but it was so perfect. So thank you so much. On Monday, it was President's Day, Black History Month. We are standing in the exhibit, having a dialogue. We have a reconstruction exhibit that looks at these amendments. I believe you helped us build it, as I nod to you for the thank you on that as well. So we're standing in front of the 14th Amendment and looking at the words. And it reminds me that years ago, Tamika Brown-Nagle, Professor Nagle, came and spoke about the 14th Amendment. And she said that every generation has a responsibility to know, understand, and really define the 14th Amendment. What are your thoughts for our students? How should they understand the 14th Amendment, watch it through the courts, and really engage themselves in this key essential right that holds all of our rights together and incorporates those fundamental freedoms in the Bill of Rights for every one of us?
Well, first I have to say that being candid, I have to say I didn't help build anything at the Constitution Center. I wish I did, but I've been wonderfully invited to participate in programs, and it's a great honor to do that. With respect to the generational, intergenerational responsibilities, it's absolutely true that each generation has to bear responsibility for either sustaining our Constitution and our constitutional principles and keeping them alive. Nothing is settled forever. I wish I had time to say more about it. I hope it's not a rabbit hole, but I think about the what's going on right now in Russia and in Ukraine. This echoes what happened in 1939 in Europe. And each generation has the responsibility for standing up for human rights and for civil rights. These battles are never won in a way that absolves subsequent generations from having to take the baton and run their leg of the race for human rights and for civil rights and certainly for constitutional rights. And so that's absolutely true. We all have continuing responsibilities, and we have the responsibility, if I can be presumptuous, not only to love our country blindly, but to love it critically. That's even more important than loving it blindly. And I hope that that makes sense to everyone who's listening to us. I love this country, but I love it sometimes in spite of what it has been, and not always because of what it has been, but I also love it critically in a way that makes me responsible for continuing to make it better. The Constitution's preamble talks about a more perfect union. That's continuing work. And so I just want to underscore that.
That is, I think, so unbelievably perfect to understand that this isn't something that we're given that will self-sustain itself, that it takes our energy. If you want a great constitution, a great society, that it takes energy from us to put it in there. So thank you so much for that. I love the idea. I love your country and love it critically. That might be the new t-shirt that I make next year for our educators. We love t-shirts here at the Constitution Center, but it's unbelievably brilliant and reminds us that it's a democracy, you know, it's a republic if we can keep it, that the energy and the baton is handed to every single one of us and handed around and shared amongst all of us together. Thank you so much. This felt like 5 seconds that we were together today. It was unbelievably wonderful. So thank you. And Jeff, you can wrap us up with any alls that you have as well.
Just thank you so much, Professor Shaw, for inspiring us to read and learn and to be part of making this a more perfect union with the 14th Amendment as the centerpiece. And thanks for all your service on behalf of equality and justice in America. Thank you, Professor Shaw. Friends, thank you. Have a wonderful weekend, all.
Thank you, everybody. Fantastic class. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Shaw.